3:15 a.m., October the 4th, a major armored battle was now unfolding in central Texas, namely on the Fort Hood installation, as numerous heavy American forces were simply smashed by the combination of coalition heavy armored forces combined with dedicated combat drones, which were ATGM missile-carrying combat strike unmanned vehicles, as well as also loitering munitions, such as the CH-901As, equipped with heat warheads, which upon slamming into heavily armored vehicles such as main battle tanks, IFVs, and even heavy armored engineering vehicles, would simply rip them to pieces and annihilate the crew inside, as shown in this devastating animation or illustration of the combat that was unfolding in the Fort Hood area, as other major battles were likewise unfolding concurrently in other parts of not only the South Central invasion sector, but also in other parts of the country beyond. The combat in the DFW area did, in fact, include some heavy armored combat, which within the first hour had seen one American tank company within the first of the 124th Cav Squadron, which in cavalry terms was a battalion-sized unit, being completely eradicated by the combination of potent PLA armored forces in the form of Type 96B main battle tanks, along with also loitering munitions such as CH-901As, as well as also very, very powerful air strikes and artillery strikes, as well as also even tactical ballistic cruise missile and even hypersonic strikes on the facility itself, upon which were elements of not just the first of the 124th Cav, but also the first of the 204th SHORAD Battalion from the 66th Troop Command of the Mississippi National Guard, who operated the Avenger systems, which were Stinger-based systems, which utilized the Humvee as its chassis. As these forces were pummeled into annihilation by the combination of 152 millimeter shells coming from one of two PLL-66 towed artillery howitzer battalions within the PLA 59th Group Army's 19th Artillery Brigade, alongside of which were also heavy fire coming in from one of two PLL-01 battalions, also of the 19th Artillery Brigade within the 59th PLA Group Army. All of this heavy firepower simply annihilated all in their wake, alongside of the cruise missile strikes from DH-10A subsonic cruise missiles, also different tactical ballistic missile strikes, which included DF-15B strikes, as well as also DF-11A strikes from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, which was actually a Trojan unit which was embedded in eastern Texas for the day of the invasion, as the DH-10A cruise missiles were fired from across the border. As although these were subsonic cruise missiles and slower than the supersonic cruise missiles, which the PLA also had, like the YJ-18C varieties, these were exceedingly long-ranged weapons and were produced in enormous quantities, which the PLA as a whole was happy to utilize, as they had enormous stocks of these. And as these were relatively very long-ranged weapons, could really reach out and hit targets, and do so with a high degree of precision, as also, in addition to these systems, were utilized DF-3As, also from the reserve battalions that were called up to bolster the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades within the PLA's Eastern Theater Command deployed to Mexico, which fired the DH-10A systems, which were the long-range subsonic cruise missiles, alongside of older systems that were specifically earmarked for their use and had been put away and maintained in storage, such as the TEL-based DF2s, DF3As, and even the scaffolding-based DF4s, which were available in small numbers but would be utilized in the invasion of the nation, as the special scaffolding had to be constructed for these intermediate range systems, which were, instead of carrying nuclear payloads, carrying very powerful conventional payloads, and had a very long range and could virtually hit anywhere inside the country from where they were in Mexico, as all of these weapons were also augmented by the latest and greatest weapons, such as the DF-17 hypersonic missile system with the DFZF hypersonic glide warheads. These were also used somewhat extensively in the South Central invasion sector, along with the DF-100 hypersonic cruise missiles as well, as all of these systems even also added to it the BRE-8 or Fire Dragon artillery-based small tactical ballistic missiles coming from the PLA 77th Group Army's artillery forces, which were currently in the Wichita Falls area, as the 77th PLA Group Army was divided roughly in half between Wichita Falls and Fort Sill, effectively taking part in two different combat operations or battles. These forces from the artillery element within the 77th PLA Group Army, which was an active duty group army, had the A300 or PHL-16 artillery systems, which were rocket artillery systems, which were a major step up from the older but still formidable PHL-03 systems. These could fire these newer tactical ballistic missiles, such as the BRE-8 Fire Dragon tactical ballistic missiles, which also smashed the Naval Air Station along with all the other systems. As in conjunction with this, all of the firepower that was utilized against the Naval Air Station and its defending forces was also the air power, such as the very powerful JH-7 Flying Leopard strike aircraft, which each carried nearly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground munitions, as well as also even a single H-6K heavy strategic bomber joining in the area to flatten not only the 1st of the 204th SHORAD Battalion, which had mostly been effectively stationed in the Lockheed Martin plant with some of its elements in the Naval Air Station for force protection operations in a SEAD operation, but they also smashed the Lockheed Martin plant to complete and total dust, as the carpet munitioning alongside of the artillery fire and the missile strikes from the strategic missile forces simply crushed all in their wake, as this SEAD operation, combined with the destruction of a major military-industrial target, was effectively a 2-for-1 in layman's terms. This accelerated the achievement of objectives within this particular portion of the battle space. At the very opening, as the combined assault between a single armored battalion from the 35th Armored Brigade alongside of a single light mechanized infantry battalion from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade had both smashed their way into the Naval Air Station against the defending forces of the 1st of the 124th, whose combat forces were deployed around the Naval Air Station, while their attached support company and headquarters company were in the Meacham International Airport, who would be assaulted later by light mechanized infantry forces after they first eradicated armed reactionary civilians on the flanks of the artillery elements. The same light mechanized infantry battalion and armored battalion from the 35th and 24th Light Infantry Brigades, respectively, would do a rapid logistical resupply after overrunning the installation, as they would be replaced shortly by an arriving light mechanized infantry battalion, as the other would go for the Meacham International Airport and mop up that area. The forces, after their 1-hour logistical resupply, would rapidly pursue, guided by their ISR capabilities, which were massive and extensive and nearly ubiquitous, as well as also Their real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which streamlined all the data and made these forces highly flexible and rapid in their response to the changing situations on the battlefield, guiding them in their maneuver and pursuit of the two fleeing American rifle companies who were using the I-820 route in order to effectively use it to find their way, as they had lost all of their navigation capabilities, ISR capabilities, and communications capabilities, not only from the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, which opened up the invasion, but also from the electronic warfare assets that were both aboard the JH-7 Flying Leopards and the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, which both carried the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods. The ground-based electronic warfare assets of the 59th PLA Group Army's Electronic Warfare Regiment also added to the removal of American redundant communications capabilities such as radio, as well as also redundant ISR capabilities such as portable radar, whether multi-mission radars, air defense radars, or other types of radars that were generator powered, as these capabilities completely removed all communications and ISR, ensuring that there was no actionable intel for American units to be able to operate effectively. These forces had to bunch up as they moved down the interstate, and they needed to do so slowly. While the interstate temporarily protected them from the PLA's heavy weapons and air power, they would eventually leave the interstate network, and they would try to find their way west as their scouts would constantly move to the west, to the east, and to the south of the main body of the forces and come back to inform them of what was seen. They would be told of PLA air assault forces operating in the downtown area, so they would attempt to steer west to steer clear of these forces, as they were also aware that there were PLA forces to the north from which they were retreating, as they would then decide it would be the most prudent to move westward. They would eventually leave the relative safety of I-820 as they were being pursued by the very same two battalions that had initially assaulted the installation. As these battalions were not slowed down by any communications or ISR issues, they were free to rapidly catch up and surround these slower moving American forces, who had to move slow because their only source of communications was line of sight or earshot communications, or using runners to spread messages over longer distances, hence the use of scouts that were moving ahead and steadily returning to inform the slow-moving main body of any potential threats on their flanks in order to guide them on their way out of this urban death trap as it was rapidly evolving into such. As the PLA's ISR network was phenomenal and massive and ubiquitous, their high-altitude reconnaissance drones, which prowled this entire battle space, as well as their quadcopter assets of nearby units, which operated in local areas and ran circuits, along with satellite-based highest altitude assets, were steadily integrated to make a 3D mapping in real time of the ever-changing modern fluid battlefield conditions, and as such, they seen the Americans on their course and were able to tailor their movements in order to rapidly surround them. As the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion, the fastest moving element of the two, between they and the armored battalion that was moving with them, would arrive first and be able to rapidly hook around the American forces as they left the highway network, and therefore be able to effectively surround them in conjunction with the follow-up armored battalion that was right behind them, having freshly annihilated the American armor that was defending the eastern side of the Naval Air Station. Although they had tried to put up a fight, the American armored forces were simply no match for the raw might of the PLA's armored forces and all of their supporting elements, including air power and artillery and more. As the Americans fought tenaciously, nonetheless, they were eradicated, and the two rifle companies were very prudent in their initiative that they took in order to retreat from the Naval Air Station and find safety elsewhere where they could try to regroup and assess the situation and figure out what to do, as time was very short because the PLA was operating on a very rapid timetable, and they could do so with their AI system streamlining all their data from ISR and other sources. The Americans had no such capabilities, and thus they moved much slower, and thus were easy to effectively surround, cordon, and destroy in many different pockets. As kill boxes developed all over the battlefield, the American forces were gradually ripped to complete shreds, both literally and figuratively speaking. The firepower advantage was also very stark, as the PLA forces simply had overwhelming firepower domination with massive amounts of artillery, missiles, both tactical ballistic cruise, but also even the hypersonic varieties, as well as also their air power. And all of this, along with their drone and robotic forces, simply all blended together to make an unbeatable force, as the AI system tied everything together and created a full feedback loop between not only the ISR capabilities and the troops on the ground, but also even the AI settings on the AI target seeking modes on loitering munitions and other systems. As the combat data links were updated by the literal second, as the AI system processed all combat data by the millisecond, the forces could see in real time where enemies were at all times, and pre-prepared strike packages would be created by the AI system and passed down to artillery FDC elements and thus to the gun lines to conduct fire missions in a very rapid form, as this, without the AI system, would have taken a bit longer in the past. Now it was streamlined and exceedingly rapid for these forces to respond to the developments as they occurred and unfolded on the battlefield in real time. As the American forces in their retreat, the two rifle companies of the former 1st of the 124th as the headquarters and its attached support company were destroyed in the Meacham International Airport, with the two other combat companies, the tank and other rifle company, destroyed guarding the Naval Air Station. The final two combat elements, the two rifle companies and their captains, had to take initiative and decide what to do. And eventually, as they left the highway network to veer to the west, they became slightly separated, as one rifle company that was leading eventually got a kilometer ahead of the other rifle company, who, upon its scouting element returning from the south, seeing as the wheel-based light mechanized infantry were much faster units than the track-based forces, including even the PLA's armored battalion, the wheel-based light mechanized infantry forces had effectively swept in and simply hooked around the Americans coming in from the north and west and hooking around them, while the armored forces were coming down to join in the encirclement, with the companies of the light mechanized infantry battalion arriving and hooking first. The American scouts, having had seen this, reported to the main body of their forces, who were now trapped in two different areas, one slightly northeast of the other, that was slightly more southwest of the other, in an industrial area by a major rail network, and the other in an upscale suburban neighborhood. As combat throughout the entire Metroplex was very diverse based on the settings, as the city had a variety of different types of areas, whether residential, commercial, industrial, or mixed, as a combination thereof, the fighting and the tactics would evolve and change based on the environment within which the forces were fighting, as combat in suburban areas, similar to what occurred in Grand Prairie and in Arlington, would resemble scenes such as this, such as what occurred in Grand Prairie in the suburbs, as the one of two rifle companies was trapped in an upscale suburban neighborhood. The armored and light mechanized infantry forces, having had surrounded these elements in these areas, would effectively split the pocket into two smaller pockets and effectively deal with mopping up each rifle company, the one in the suburban area and the other in the industrial area, similar to the scenes that unfolded in the fight against the 2nd of the 142nd in Richardson, where they were defending the Raytheon facility, a large industrial site. The fighting in the industrial area in the southwest of Fort Worth would resemble scenes such as these as well, as fighting would be occurring by a major rail network with a small number of factories and a large number of warehouse buildings and offices in this area. The Americans, having now had their scouts return to inform them that the light mechanized infantry forces had been spotted to their south, having it hooked around them, they had returned and the Americans had done a wagon circle in order to defend their position. Even a grouping of troops had begun to fill sandbags and make small sandbag emplacements within the area as headquarters troops had moved into this warehouse building and occupied it to use it as a temporary command post. As their combat platoons had again done a wagon circle effectively around the area, headquarters vehicles would be nestled between some of these sandbag emplacements, the rail embankments, and the warehouse building itself, within which the headquarters troops, most of which were now in position within. As the company captain of the company now trapped in the industrial site was a realist and was fully aware of his situation, he opted to go down fighting, as again, despite the overwhelming odds that were against them, some American units opted to fight bravely and tenaciously against all odds, and would inflict some casualties upon the PLA, although the PLA, again, here had overwhelming advantages. There would be two Wing Loom 2 dedicated combat drones firing CM502KG, dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missiles at targets below. As these missiles were so powerful in their penetration capabilities, they were dubbed dual-purpose systems, as they could penetrate battleship armor, as well as also main battle tanks with ease. As the HJ-10, an anti-tank guided missile, was also very powerful and destructive, the CM502KG had slightly better penetration capabilities. There would also be large numbers of loitering munitions, as the dedicated combat drone section within the headquarters company of the armored battalion that was in hot pursuit would fire a volley of 48 heat warhead equipped loitering munitions, which would easily rip American vehicles to shreds and also be able to penetrate building materials of buildings and eliminate personnel in certain areas of buildings that were hiding behind walls and firing out of windows and such. As also the tanks, one tank company of 4 from the pursuing tank battalion from the 35th Armored Brigade, one tank company would be sent into this area to combat these American forces in conjunction with one of 6 light mechanized infantry companies with an attached platoon, one of 4 combat platoons of their own fire support element, which was an anti-tank company. There would be one platoon from their anti-tank company of the WZ-550 vehicles with their 4 HJ-09 ATGMs, as these would spread out amongst the company, one of 6 light mechanized infantry companies, and assist them in the mopping up of American forces. As these WZ-550 vehicles gave a very powerful punch to these light mechanized infantry forces, as these ATGMs had a 3.5-mile range and were very powerful, these gave the light mechanized infantry forces a true tank-busting capability, as well as also even the short-range HJ-73Cs, one on each side on a rail system of the very powerful ZBL-08 IFV version of the ZBL-08 vehicles, as there were also the APC versions with a heavy machine gun turret for a W85 12.7mm heavy machine gun with a 35mm Gatling autocannon on the IFV version, as they also had their two ATGMs, their short-range HJ-73Cs, and, of course, a coax 7.62 by 54mm machine gun for dealing specifically with infantry forces that were closer to the vehicle, as these very powerful systems equipping the light mechanized infantry forces, which also gave him an exceedingly high level of mobility, making them capable of outrunning track-based units, and thus making it possible for them to intercept and cut off the fleeing Americans who had a head start. These were formidable forces, and in conjunction with the arriving armor, would play a major role in the fighting that would occur in not just the industrial area, like so in this picture, as a Wingloom 2 dedicated combat drone is firing a CM502KG, one of many CH-901A loitering munitions, is about to come down and crash into a target, as many vehicles in this particular animation or illustration, if you will, have been completely and totally annihilated, as the vehicle crew / dismount squad-based ISR assets, the quadcopters, would be running circuits over the battle space, finding targets with which the real-time AI battlefield data processing system could influence the AI target-seeking mode on loitering munitions, as well as also advise the ground forces on where to move, how to move, and what weapons to use, where and when, and coordinate actions between ground forces, drones, and air power from the PLAAF when and where necessary, as the armor would effectively mop up one of two rifle companies in the industrial area. The other tank company of 4, along with a armored infantry company, would effectively move in to the suburban area, and they would engage and destroy the other rifle company, as the rest of the light mechanized infantry companies, the other 2 tank companies from the tank battalion, besides the 2 that were engaged in combat, and the other rifle company, or the other armored infantry company, rather, that was not engaged in combat, would continue to hold the perimeter, as not only would they have ATGM capabilities from the light mechanized infantry battalion's company of WZ-550s, they would also have the armored battalion's anti-tank capability in the form of their anti-tank company with their very powerful HJ-10 based vehicles. These AFT-10s, with their long-ranged and very powerful HJ-10 ATGMs, could rain down enormous destruction on enemy forces, as each of these companies had 20 of these vehicles, and each vehicle had 8 ATGMs aboard. And again, these were very long range for an ATGM, as the HJ-10 had a 6.2-mile range, which outranged many other ATGM types, and through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, sending back targeting data, these vehicles were exceedingly effective in supporting their armored elements within their own battalions, as well as other forces, friendly forces, that were along with them in the combat. So in this particular animation or illustration, if you will, there are HJ-10s in flight over the battlefield, moving in to hit targets. There is an ATGM, an HJ-08 being fired from a soldier in this column alongside of this IFV, and these troops are laying down heavy volumes of small arms fire, as well as also being supported by loitering munitions in the battle space, as well as their squad-based quadcopter assets comb the battlefield for targets as they recon the area to send the data back to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which would update the squad leaders and vehicle crews through their combat data links on where exactly enemy forces were, which made these forces highly efficient in destroying their enemies, as they knew exactly where they were at all times. As the combat in the suburban area would involve fighting not only the American Rifle Company, but along with them, the PLA forces would also be engaging armed reactionary civilian elements in this area as well, as there were certain areas within the country where there were armed reactionary or just simply armed civilians that weren't reactionary who had special skills, as in they could put together certain implements that could cause devastation against enemy forces, as this was not very common at the opening of the invasion. It would gradually become a more and more common factor as the invasion were to continue on, as at the very beginning, there was only a small handful of American forces throughout the South Central invasion sector, including some armed reactionary civilian elements, that would initiate these types of attacks. Some would be successful, while others would not. And as the armored infantry would sweep through the suburban neighborhood to flush out not only the rifle company elements that were now trapped in this area and surrounded by both the light mechanized infantry battalions, companies, that besides the one that was engaged in the industrial area with one of 4 combat platoons from the anti-tank company of WZ-551s, but they were also surrounded by the elements of the armored battalion. And as these two areas, again, this rather wealthy suburban area was a kilometer to the southwest of this industrial area by the rail network. As again, these two rifle companies have become separated because one got a bit further ahead of the other, and they would be effectively cut off into 2 smaller pockets by the other elements of the light mechanized infantry battalion and armored battalion, respectively, that were in pursuit of these forces. And thus they would be annihilated through sweeps of the area. This was a high-end area, a wealthy area. There were, again, certain people with certain skills. There would be a truck-based improvised device that would be put together with some munitions and other components and accelerants that were available to the forces of this particular rifle company, although it would be destroyed because it would be hit by tank shell fire, as the PLA forces were not going to pass this abandoned vehicle, as it was highly suspect. And there would also be a civilian with the same skills who would make one as well. And this would also be destroyed and would badly destroy these homes, as this would be made from a pickup truck and other materials that were in the bed of it. As artillery support would be very efficient and also potent in this area, as these would be basically precision strikes carried out by a PLL 66 battalions comprising batteries, as some of the batteries would be devoted to this operation that comprised the battalion, as well as also some batteries from the PLL 01 battalion that would be devoted to this operation. As also in the industrial area with the other rifle company, there would also be precision artillery strikes on certain positions carried out by different batteries within the 2 available artillery battalions. As it has to be understood at all times, these different artillery battalions that comprised the 19th Artillery Brigade had many different fire missions all throughout the battle space, and some batteries were devoted to specific sectors while others were to other areas. And in this particular instance, there would be several different batteries, both from the PLL 66 Battalion, which was the 152 millimeter towed howitzers, and also the PLL 01 Battalion that would be devoted to this particular operation, and thus would be called upon to fire in support of the PLA armored forces that were moving into the area, both the industrial area as well as also the suburban area, which included also their armored infantry company that was deployed to sweep the suburbs of enemy forces, which included not just armed reactionary civilians, but also military personnel from the two different rifle companies. Again, one company in the industrial area, the other in the suburban area, as they would have also support from their AFT-10 anti-tank company within the armored battalion, which were also very powerful in terms of supporting forces. In the industrial area, they would also have support from the WZ-550 platoon, one of 4 combat platoons with its headquarters platoon, with the other 3 combat platoons and headquarters platoon assigned to the other 5 of 6 light mechanized infantry companies, which were surrounding the area, as the company had been broken up into its 4 combat platoons and headquarters company, which was the logistics and command elements of the WZ-550 anti-tank company. They were effectively spread out in order to mutually support all of the different light mechanized infantry companies. As the armored battalion's anti-tank company had much longer range, the AFT-10s tended to sit back much further away from the combat that was ensuing, and thus be able to fire at leisure miles away from the battles where they were unfolding, thus keeping these systems relatively safe, as well as also being able to deliver destruction from a long range. As the industrial area along the tracks, again, would see heavy combat as the Americans would try to wagon circle their vehicles to the best of their ability. They would eventually be forced to move to engage some of the PLA forces, as some of the platoon leaders and platoon sergeants would make attempts at a breakout, as they would be forced to take initiative, as all communications once again had been broken down and no longer really existed. This would result in their rapid decimation, as picking them apart would be easier than ever, as single vehicles made easy ideal targets, although there would be dismounted troops that would try to put up heavy resistance alongside of their vehicles, but they too would be swept aside with ease. Some, equipped with AT-4s, would cause some damage and some KIAs, while others would not be so fortunate and wouldn't really take down any enemies with them, as they would be eradicated by the combo of PLA armor, light mechanized infantry, and some precision artillery strikes, as well as also a large quantity of CH-901A loitering munitions and 2 dedicated Wing Loom 2 combat drones, firing at targets below. As all of this firepower was simply immense, the destruction that would be wrought upon these battle spaces would be likewise immense. From all of the raging combat, there would also be effectively what the PLA considered collateral damage, because there would be innocent civilians in relatively sizable numbers that would be wiped out as well. As we go to the map, by about 3:15, again, as other armored battles are raging elsewhere, including even in DFW, such as the armored combat raging just in the eastern edges of downtown, the armored battle that had concluded in the Naval Air Station had led to these forces and eventually being surrounded by the pursuing PLA-2 battalions. And as these forces were now surrounded and forced to fight, they would be rapidly picked apart as the combat in both the industrial area as well as also in the suburban area would both each last around an hour, although the fighting in the suburbs would last slightly longer, approximately an hour and 20 minutes. The fighting would effectively all be over before 4:45, and the PLA forces in this area, after having had swept the area thoroughly, both the light mechanized infantry forces and the armored forces, would effectively stay in the area in order to aid in highway security. As in this particular area, what's very important of note is that major highway junctions were in this area: I-30 and I-820, and of course I-30 and I-20. And these areas would be secured by these two battalions as they could spread out and control a large area upon having had destroyed the retreating American forces. As this light mechanized infantry battalion at the very opening had already moved into this area on the outer edges of the DFW Metroplex and destroyed this arising threat of armed reactionary civilians, they too would be in the area to assist in security of the entry and exit, the main artery leading into the DFW Metroplex coming from the west. And now, at 3:15 a.m., the battle was about to begin, as the combat drone sections within the two battalions, both the armored battalion and light mechanized infantry battalion, had fired 48 loitering munitions apiece, which would play a large role in the destruction not only of the American Army forces in both different battle areas, the industrial and suburban areas, but also groupings of armed reactionary civilians that were trying to flee on the highways that were just immediately to the south of these areas. As there were still, at this point in time, some people that were making attempts to utilize the highway systems to both get out of the area or to join in combat, as there were armed reactionary civilian elements that would use these highway networks to get to different areas where PLA troops were known to be. And this would result in their destruction from above by the CH-901A loitering munitions, which patrolled the highways diligently, along with also some Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drones like so, as the highways were highly critical to the PLA, both to their logistical and troop movements, but also for the occupation and colonization efforts that were to follow as the nation would be crushed underneath the weight of the PLA. As the PLA had its civil-military fusion policy, many had no idea what this entailed. As it pertained to fourth-generation warfare doctrines, the civil-military fusion policy simply meant that anything with a civilian usage could be converted for military usage, and this included CCP regime properties in foreign nations, including the target nations like the USA, which they had planned to conquer after their invasion. As also, all civilian transport could even be requisitioned for military use, although this wasn't really necessary. It was a clause within the civil-military policy that could be utilized, as well as also even the ability to instantly retool all civilian manufacturing plants for military production, as they were already set up for this. Although the ordinary military-industrial complex of the PLA, of the CCP regime, was already so gargantuan, its production capacity so enormous, that they didn't really have to use this clause either, as even their peacetime production was so massive that no other nation could realistically compete with them in this regard, and the American military-industrial complex had shrunk to very small levels. As this video simply introduces the battle that was to occur in the southwest of the city of Fort Worth, the more tactical aspects of these combat operations will be effectively gone over in the following installation of this series, as the PLA armor and armored infantry forces of their armored battalion moved into place to conduct their sweeping operations in the suburbs, as well as the light mechanized infantry forces moving into place as well, as they were the first to arrive on scene and effectively surround American forces through their hook maneuver coming down from the north and swinging around toward the east. These forces again would contribute one of their 6 light mechanized infantry companies and 1 platoon from their anti-tank company to the operation occurring in the industrial area in conjunction with PLA armor, as they too were moving into the area to effectively eradicate any and all resistance that was discovered. Again, they would have heavy support from not just dedicated combat drones and loitering munitions, but also from precision artillery strikes that would be called in to the area, as well as the artillery would play a key role along with their own anti-tank capabilities, both from the HJ-10s and the WZ-550s, with the artillery firepower from the 19th Artillery Brigade, would dominate the battlefield and easily suppress and annihilate all enemy forces. It has to be understood at all times, without communications, without ISR capabilities, without any actionable intel whatsoever at all, a force is simply combat ineffective and can do nothing against a force that has total firepower dominance, a force that has total ISR dominance, total AI streamlining data dominance, as well as also the additional new weapons that were being put to use, some already having had been tested in combat, while others had not been, throughout the entire invasion, as there were many new weapons being utilized against the American military and other forces, as the American military, its paramilitary forces, and its armed reactionary civilians had no recourse against a force like this, as 12.5 million coalition troops smashed the nation to literal pieces, as the largest ever land invasion force, air armada, sea armada, and missile strike forces put together in one place at one time had been let loose against the target nation, which was the United States of America. There was no recourse once ISR communications and even redundant systems had been completely lost. There was no recourse. Coordination broke down after communication broke down. Organization fell apart. Logistics fell apart. And an army cannot operate effectively without logistics. When an army is out of ammunition, it can no longer fight. When an army can no longer eat, it can no longer fight. When an army runs out of fuel, it can no longer move. Everything was failing because there was no way to communicate. The tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and on-booting of electronic warfare assets in the various different initial combat zones had taken everything down, as the initial combat zones were only the areas where the coalition forces had originated at, as they would move on to secondary and tertiary areas, as the tertiary areas would be last, after secondary areas had been mopped up after the primary areas. Once primary and secondary areas fell, which was effectively your major cities, their medium cities, and key small cities that had important objectives within them, the nation as a whole was lost because all that would be left would be the tertiary areas to be mopped up. Although this was not to say that the war was over, it was just to say that effectively speaking, the coalition would be in full control of the nation, although there would be a massive partisan uprising against the occupation forces, which would drag on for years. As this would become New China, colonization would ensue. Concurrently to this, running parallel to this, would be a massive counterinsurgency war that would have to be waged by the CCP regime, along with its remaining allies who opted to stay and assist them in the control of their new colony, of their new overseas resource-rich empire, as many of the nation's resources would be strip-mined and sent back to China for their gargantuan industrial complex. The locals would continue to put up resistance as gradually over time, despite high losses, more and more and more civilians would begin to take up arms, as many millions by this point in time, already on day one, will have already fled into the wilderness throughout the United States, where they would begin to regroup, get organized, get coordinated, figure out their logistics, and try to come up with plans in their respective local areas. As this would be a spontaneous occurrence in many areas, it would effectively be the beginning of a full-scale uprising, but this would not occur until the 4-day invasion will have concluded and the Chinese and their allies will have been victorious. More to come in the next installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines, utilizing real-world everything.